have another minute or so. Give people time if they're dropping kiddos off to get back. Well, good evening. I appreciate the fact they've got the thermostat turned up and that we can be together in a nice, warm building. But it's wonderful to see you tonight. I don't know how many of you have been looking for furniture lately, but you may have seen this where you go in and they are trying to get you to look at a particular piece of furniture and they have some sort of sales pitch with it. And the man selling the furniture said, this is a great couch, you'll really like the way it sits, and I promise you it can seat 5 people without any problem. And I looked at it and I got thinking about it, and you may have seen this online, but I looked at it and then thought, well, you know what? I don't know 5 people without any problems. And so I didn't buy the couch. And so we are talking about sensitive issues the next couple of times I teach. And when you read your Bibles, you know that Jesus just had a heart for people. You know that it says in John 11 that when he heard that his friend had died, that he wept. There are just so many times when it says that in the Bible, it'll say he was moved with compassion. That literally is saying that he was twisted in his gut. And so we can understand that type of idiom or picture. When we've hurt for somebody and we feel it. We used to talk with Faith's daddy, and if we were telling him something about a mutual relationship and someone we knew that was hurting, you could just see him hurting while he was listening to the story because he cared about people. And so when you think about that and you think about loved ones in your life and mine that we know and we love, you feel for them. I was called when I was a teenager to go down to one of the hospitals in downtown Columbus, Ohio. And when I walked in, I asked someone where I would find a 13-year-old that I was asked to go see. And they said, well, if you don't mind, if you can sit in here with the doctor, he's going to come down and he's going to talk to the parents. If you don't mind waiting with that, where you're a young minister, might be helpful to them. And I had no idea that the doctor was going to sit down and tell the parents that their child was not going to survive. My first gospel meeting I ever preached, I drove out to what was known as the River congregation outside of Philippi, West Virginia. And I might have been 20, but I think I was 19. And drove out there and got there. And after I had spoken that morning, someone came and grabbed me and said, we're going to go and visit this young couple, and we need you to explain to them why it is that they have lost their baby. And you know that I had about this much, that I could think to try to offer at that age. But I come from a large family, and so I've watched a lot of people with chronic illnesses through the years. Have about 50 first cousins. Dad had 11 brothers and sisters. My mom had 8 brothers and sisters. And so from sudden things that happened, like a brain aneurysm and that my Aunt Mildred had that they couldn't reverse at that time and didn't have the treatments and things to try to stop it, and she bled to death internally. I'd go out and spend a week or two in the summers with her and my Uncle John on their farm. And I can remember, I was just at a vantage point that was unique and to where I was sitting, I guess. And when they lowered the casket, the last thing I saw was her profile. And I was emotional, and I can remember thinking inside my heart, goodbye forever. And, you know, a 13-year-old cousin that had to have a pump in his head most of his life, that deceased at a young age, suicide, just different types of chronic illness. And so it just, and it's continued to the point that recently my Aunt Janice, the only living of my parents' siblings, been in and out of the hospital and has been really sick. And she dropped everything when my mother was dying of cancer and went from Charlottesville, Virginia, and stayed at our home in Columbus, Ohio, on the east side of Columbus, and took care of my mom. And so you probably had plenty of experiences like that too. And I can remember growing up, the phone would ring and I'd hear my mom on the phone, and then she'd get off and we'd hear that so-and-so had died, and then we'd get another call, it seemed like in a few days. And I can remember the phrase, and maybe you've heard this too, that where they said, you know, death comes in threes, you know, and didn't think a lot about that. But Faith's father died in December of '88. Her grandfather died in January of '90, 13 months later. My mother died a year later, and then about 10 months after my mother died, we got a call. We had driven in from Chicago Thanksgiving weekend. We're putting the kids in bed, and the phone rang, and we were told that Faith's grandmother was in Vanderbilt Hospital and wasn't really showing signs that she was going to survive. And I told them we'd get up there as soon as we could. And our twins' bedroom was just right across the hallway. And I remember my son Andrew coming across. And at that point, in '91, he's about 5 years old. And he came in our bedroom and he said, "Why is everybody in our family dying?" And it was just a sensitivity he had that just kind of blew me away. And I looked at Faith and I said, "We're not driving to Nashville tonight. We're going tomorrow morning." And so, you know, through the church work I've done for years, I've been called into situations that when I was young and thinking about going into ministry that I never thought that I'd be dealing with. I've been called down to Vanderbilt Hospital after a motor vehicle accident and went back to see someone, and as I'm sitting there with her, I'm just watching her bleed through different layers of sheets, and it didn't take long before she passed. My brother's college teammate that many of you may have known or watched play ball at Lipscomb years ago in the late 70s or mid-70s when Coach Meyer first came there, Barry Harrison, was life-flighted to Vanderbilt Hospital a few months ago, and I got a call toward the end of my work day from my brother saying Barry's in the hospital and he's not going to make it. And went down to the hospital, and an aorta had dissected, and just he was bleeding out inside, and they said he would never survive the surgery. But it took about 5 days of him being awake and aware, and he bled to death. And so there are acute things that happen, accidents, chronic illness. And what we're trying to talk about in this class is how do we prepare. And Kevin last week had mentioned about talking about healthcare decisions and services. He's been talking about other aspects of preparation. And I don't want to rush through this material, and I want you to feel free to raise your hand, stop me at any point, and ask questions. And I'm happy to try to answer those to the best of my ability. And if I don't have the answer tonight, I'll find it out, okay? But, you know, we're talking about trying to protect your family as much as you can as you do that. And these first 3 slides I've shown you before, but, you know, when you talk about these type of issues and what we're hearing about how many times every day right now about COVID, you know, you're talking about chronic illnesses, a disease that over the time which you live, you'll be managing symptoms and complications of those illnesses, most likely if you're diagnosed with congestive heart failure or chronic kidney disease, you know, that type of thing. And it's unstated, but the disease may not be curable, but the signs and symptoms of it need to be managed. And so most healthcare providers don't relish the thought of answering those types of questions about whether or not something is going to eventually kill someone. But you know, the likelihood is there with COVID right now, and it's an acute illness. But what you've heard from the very start, if you stack that on top, if you have an acute illness on top of a chronic illness, then it can be more lethal. But we know that there are acute illnesses that happen. Someone goes in the hospital with pneumonia, and then all of a sudden they have sepsis and their kidneys are shutting down, and they don't come out. That happened with Faith's grandfather. He's in the hospital with flu, and I was sitting with him all night, every night, and one day he told my uncle he was going to die. And I looked at my uncle, Faith's uncle, actually. He treated me like I was his own nephew. And he said, listen to him. And he was a doctor. And I said, what do you mean, listen to him? And he said, you'd be surprised how many people through the years have told me things that I didn't really see and diagnose, but they told me what was going on in their body and how they were doing. And he said, then I wasn't surprised when they died. And so you have acute illnesses. They can stack on top of chronic diseases, and older adults that are more immunocompromised will be more at risk. And you know, one thing I've learned in taking care of people at end of life is that, like with an illness like dementia, it's often not the dementia or Alzheimer's disease or, you know, whatever type of dementia it might be that kills them, but it's some sort of infection they get secondary to the dementia. And it's the illness, aspiration pneumonia, or some sort of other infection that affects their kidneys. You know, and so it's amazing what can happen with an acute illness that you're not anticipating. That's why it's important to have things in place. And then we're all familiar with the term of terminal illness, and it may not indicate that the patient's in the last few months of life, but what it's used to do is to describe a chronic illness that will not be cured and ultimately could be the cause of death. And so the goal may be to try to prevent progression as long as you can. But here's some things that Kevin mentioned last week that are important for us to know. In 2004, the Tennessee Healthcare Decisions Act put into place a law that said every person has the right to make their own health care decisions. There was kind of a paternalistic approach to medicine years ago that some of you might remember. And if the doctor said you need to have this surgery, you probably just said, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and you scheduled the surgery. Or if a doctor said you need to treat this and do that, you know, a lot of us are kind of trained to say yes to those decisions. And so I've been around people that have gone through 4 or 5 different layers of treatment for cancer. And then, you know, they're told again that, well, there's a brand new study being done, and it looks like it's going to have some promise, and we can get you enrolled in that study. And so people will go from one trial to the next trial to the next trial. And while they're doing all of that, they don't have much quality of life. And you have to stop and think, what's important to the person. And people need to know that they have a right to make decisions. And so that's important. And then part of what this act did, back in 1991, there's a Patient Self-Determination Act done federally, and it said that if a hospital or a facility was going to receive Medicare and Medicaid services as funding, they have to give each incoming patient a statement of rights regarding making healthcare decisions. So you can have a kidney stone, go to the emergency room, and while you're in the emergency room, the hospital is obligated to talk to you about the fact that you have a right to make healthcare decisions for yourself. And so they'll ask you, do you have an advance care directive? If so, do you have a copy of it with you? If not, why don't we talk about that quickly and try to fill that out once they get you kind of stabilized with whatever the situation is. And then the healthcare providers have to have a policy regarding how they'll implement the advance directives, and they have to document in medical records if a patient has an advance directive. So I could take you to I don't know how many different skilled nursing facilities here, and when you pull out their chart that's often behind where the nurse is sitting, you can look at the charts and there'll be labels on the chart, and it'll say DNR, or it may say DNR, DNI, and it's indicating to you before you even open the little notebook and chart that these people have advanced care directives, and it's leading you to know that this is something that is in place. Years ago, I was in a facility. I wasn't a healthcare provider, just there as a minister, and walked into a room right as a man had been discovered being on the floor. And they started giving CPR to him. They called in an ambulance, got him stabilized, took him to the hospital. I went to the hospital, and his son came in, and his son was livid because his father had an advanced care directive that said, do not resuscitate. And here his father was in the hospital, intubated with a tube, and having been brought back with CPR. And then they were going to have to make other types of decisions when his father said, if that happens, don't do that. And so it's important that things are done properly. And so this is an acronym, but it was an initiative that was started years ago, and this was their slogan. It's about how you live. And by that, they were meaning that individuals need to have information so they can make informed decisions about care they want to receive or care they don't want to receive. And so what we're going to try to do is talk about learning about options for end-of-life services, about how do you implement plans, how do you voice decisions, not only to a doctor or a facility, but how do you voice that to your own family? Because there are different people in the family. Like in our family, you'd get to the hospital, and there'd be, let's just say my dad, and there'd be 3 children. And then, though, there were brothers or sisters-in-laws or sisters or brother-in-laws or different relatives that wanted to chime in with what should be done or shouldn't be done. But in my dad's case, he had made his decisions. And so we knew what those were. But you have to share that with other people. And sometimes that's not done. Sometimes paper like that's maybe been completed with an attorney or with someone, and it's in a file cabinet drawer. And the family doesn't have any idea what that one person has decided until something happens. They have to go find it in order to help them at the hospital. And then you need to engage to not only for yourself, but to help other people understand. And so we're going to spend a little time talking about advanced care directives, but we'll also have something to say about what's known as a post form, physician's orders for scope of treatment, or the post is what's being used more and more. It's physician orders for life-sustaining treatment. And so we'll talk about that, but as we talk about advanced directives, you're going to see that most of what is in the advanced directives is in the post form as well. And they serve two different purposes. So on May 9th, 2017, the Advanced Directives for Healthcare form was modified, and Kevin mentioned this last week. And so now, when you get that form, and I can bring some blank ones if you'd like for me to and copy them for you. When you get that form, it now contains what it was once known as Living Will or Advanced Care Plan, and it also has a section there for a medical power of attorney or the appointment of a healthcare agent. And so we're going to talk about what that means to appoint someone to be an agent in just a minute. But what you're talking about is a written document that sets out your preferences for health care should you become incompetent, or if you become unable to communicate your preferences to medical personnel, or if you want to withdraw or to withhold life-saving procedures. And you can record your wish, if you want, to receive all available medical treatment. So it's a wide range of services that you can select if you want to. And so an emancipated minor, so you're talking about someone that's relatively young, but legally they're in a position where they're regarded as being able to make their own decisions, or a competent adult can fill out these forms. And the form has to be in substantial compliance with the law. And so Tennessee, if you go to the government website, they have a website where you can print these off. And so that way, it's something that the government's approved. It's specifically for this state. And from state to state, there may be some variations about what these say. It has to be witnessed by two adults, or it has to be notarized by a notary republic. And so one witness has to be a person not related by blood or marriage or adoption, and they have to be a person not entitled to any portion of the estate. Has to be a person that's not being appointed as a healthcare agent or surrogate decision maker. Has to be a person that's not financially responsible for the individual medical care, and it cannot be the attending physician, because he may have a bias one way or another, but it's the patient's choice. And so you can see they're trying ethically to protect you there by saying, you don't want someone who's going to profit off your passing be making your decisions, or telling, people what to do or not to do. And so you have to be careful about appointing that person. So part one, if you look at an advanced care directive form, is the appointment of an agent. And what it is, it's giving you the ability to say, I want the following person to make healthcare decisions for me, and this includes any healthcare decision I could have made for myself if able, except that my agent must follow my instructions below, what follows on the form. And then you identify who you want that person to be. And they're going to ask you on the form to provide their name and their contact number and all that type of thing, so they can reach them if they have to. And then you're doing one of two things. You're saying, when I sign this and I make this effective, I give my agent permission to make health care decisions for me at any time, even if I have capacity to make decisions for myself. Or you can say, I do not give such permission. This form only applies when I no longer have capacity to make those decisions for myself. And so it's an important decision. I think it was 6 years ago in April, I think it was 2016, that Senator Bill Frist and I wrote an opinion editorial that the Fox News organization up in New York picked up and put on their, not on their national website, but their international website, about whom will you appoint. You know that Ben Franklin is often quoted as saying, the only two things you can know for sure, are death and taxes. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but typically, you have April 15th as tax day, and April 16th is National Healthcare Decisions Day. And so it's interesting that they've, tied those two things together. And so that's why we published that editorial in August of that year. But it was all about who you're going to choose and why it's important to make that designation. And so the authority of a person that is your surrogate decision maker or your health care agent becomes effective only upon determination that the individual lacks capacity, if that's the way that they have chosen for their form to be read. And it ceases to be effective upon determination that the individual has recovered capacity. So it sounds a little bit like a president having to have his gallbladder removed. And so for those few hours when he's under and he doesn't have capacity, the vice president, becomes the acting president for a while. And then when the president is back with capacity, then he goes back to being president. It's the same thing here about the authority you're giving an agent to make decisions for you. And so when you periodically remove review your directives, they may no longer reflect your wishes. You may have said something when you were 45 that now that you're 65, you want to change. And so it's important for all of us to know that this isn't an irrevocable document. This is something you can revoke, you can change as time goes on. And in the hospice work I've done, there are people that'll fill it out and they'll say, I don't want this intervention, I don't want that intervention, but then when the rubber hits the road, sometimes they say, no, maybe I do. And so they want to go to the hospital. And so what happens in a situation like that, they have to revoke their advanced care directive to receive the treatment. And, or revoke their hospice relationship, basically, is what's really happening, in order to do that. And then they can come out of the hospital and then they can go back on hospice, if something drastically hadn't changed about their health care. And so what you can do is create a new one if you want to change something. And so that makes all earlier versions obsolete. And so then, though, what you have to do, it'd be helpful to do, is to notify people in your sphere of references that maybe would be involved in your care if something were to happen. You need to notify them that you've made this new change and maybe provide them copies of your completed new advance directive. And so when an advance directive for health care is revoked or a new one is created, you need to inform your physician, health care providers. If you have a hospital that you always go to, you need to inform them. If you have a place that you think you'd go, if you ever had to have rehab or some extended stay in a facility, you need to give them a copy and just make sure that the medical records departments are documented so you have that information. But here's where some challenging thought comes in beyond that. It's a big deal to choose someone that will make decisions for you. And so, walked into my dad's room when he was near the end of life. He had had specific decisions that he had made about nutrition. And there was a young lady sitting on the edge of his bed, force-feeding him, because she felt like that we as children were just trying to starve my dad to death. But we had no involvement in that decision. He had made it about 8 years before. And so we just talked to her kindly and said, we need to respect our dad's decisions, and you don't need to force feed him. And so when you get to past who you would choose to be a healthcare agent, the second part of the form has to do with your wishes for quality of life and your wishes for different types of treatment. And these are the types of conversations I've often had, just sitting with people in their living room of their home. And so it begins by saying that yes, there are conditions with which you're willing to live if you're given adequate comfort care and pain management. And then there may be conditions with which you're not willing to live that would create an unacceptable, what you deem to be an unacceptable quality of life. And so here are the broad categories. If they could keep you comfortable, would you be willing to live with permanent unconscious conditions? And so sometimes things happen to where a person becomes totally unaware of people or surroundings with little chance of ever waking up from the coma. And, Kevin referenced the Terry Schiavo case, and that was something that was very publicized when Terry Schiavo and her family were arguing about whether or not life support could be withdrawn or not. And Senator Frist even expressed publicly an opinion about that years ago. And there were a lot of people who didn't like what Senator Frist said. And so if you can avoid having to be in that situation and make those decisions at a time of crisis, if you can think through them and make them in advance, it's better to be able to do that. The second broad category is living in a state of permanent confusion, where you become unable to remember, understand, or make decisions. You don't recognize your loved ones anymore. You cannot have a clear conversation with them. So what they're asking you to do is say, do you want to have everything done to save my life, keep my heart beating, keep my kidneys functioning, no matter what you do for interventions, even though I don't know anyone and don't have any quality of life? Or do I want to limit the interventions and do that? I remember talking to my dad, and my dad said, son, I believe in prayer. I believe God has the ability to intervene any time that he feels an intervention needs to be made. And he said, but if he feels like that right now this illness just needs to run its course, and if I die, he said, I'm comfortable with that. And so he stipulated, I don't want this done, I don't want that done, I don't want this done. And we respected his wishes. Third broad category is, if you've ever had a loved one in a nursing home, and you go to one of those family meetings, they'll talk about activities of daily living. And things we do every day, and we don't think about them necessarily as activities of daily living, as a medical term or a description of what we do. But if you're no longer able to talk or communicate clearly, if you're no longer able to move by yourself, to ambulate by yourself, to go where you'd like to go, and if you are just dependent on others for feeding and bathing, dressing and walking, and rehabilitation or any other restorative treatment is not going to help, then what would you say? That doesn't matter. Just, move me from place to place and, and do what you have to do to take care of me and keep me comfortable? Or would you say, no, I don't want to live that way? And some people would say, no, I don't want to burden my family that way. And again, those are very personal decisions, and it's what the law says you can make. You can make. And then those decisions are to be respected. And one of the challenging things when you're a healthcare provider and you're in a situation like that, and 3 family members come in from out of town and they want to change everything and turn over the cart, what I have to look to them and say is, well, I understand what you're saying, and I understand you have feelings. You have family here. You all can get together and talk about it. But this is what your mother said she wanted done or didn't want done when she was of clear mind. And you may want to do it differently, but, ultimately what the law says is she has, or he had, the right to say that and to make that decision. And so sometimes you run into situations where people don't want to respect the decisions of their family member. They want to make the decision themselves. And then what we tend to think of most often is this broad category of end-stage illness. There are times when illnesses just reach their final stages. And that's in spite of full treatment. It's what Atul Gawande, who wrote the book Being Immortal, says to his medical peers, and he said it publicly a number of times in presentations. Became a New York Times bestseller. And Dr. Gawande just says, look, we can prolong life for a good time. We've shown that medically. But we haven't created good quality of life for people. And we make interventions, and then we end up putting them in a situation to where they live longer, but they also suffer longer. And he said, medically, what people are thinking we can do, we haven't been able to do. And, he's a big advocate for people being able to make informed decisions. So, widespread cancer, no longer responding to treatment. Chronic and or damaged heart or lungs where oxygen is needed most of the time and activities are limited due to the feeding of or feeling of suffocation. I've gone into people's homes to sit down and try to help them manage their symptoms, and it takes every bit of energy that they have to walk 15 feet from their bedroom to their living room couch. And some people say, I want to keep going as long as I can. And other times people look at me and they say, I am so tired. And I just can't live this way. And that's when you ask someone, what would be a good day for you? Just tell me what you think at this point in your life, what would be a good day. And when you hear their heart and you share that with their family, then sometimes what comes up then is, why are we putting our loved one through all of these treatments and all? I'd looked at my dad in the eye and I told him that I loved him, that I would miss him, but I would do what he asked me to do as far as standing behind the decisions he made. And the way Dad said it to me was, he said, I'm ready to go home. And we were just a couple of miles away from his house. I said, Dad, you want to go to the house? He said, no, son. He said, you know exactly what I mean. He said, I miss your mom. Mom had been gone, about 17 years at that point. He said, I want to be with her. He said, I feel good about my relationship with God. And that meant the world to me. It meant everything to me. And he said, I want you to respect my wishes. So what else could I do? And so there are burdens to illnesses that are just tough. And so you have to consider, and we'll talk about this later, the benefits and the burdens. Now, indicate your wishes for treatment. And we're going to run out of time, so we'll pick this back up the next time I talk. But, you know, when you're talking about CPR, whether or not you want CPR, that's the first category under making your wishes for treatment known. CPR is done to try to make the heart beat again and restore breathing after it's stopped. And usually it involves electric shock or chest compressions, breathing assistance. So we need to understand what all's involved. And I'm going to share some things with you that maybe you know completely, and maybe some of your impressions are 100% accurate and some may not be. Some of you probably seen this commercial on TV for Sling TV, and ladies on the floor in a restaurant. You're not told why she's on the floor, but this lady gets up and she runs over to her and starts to look at her and try to help. And someone says, "Are you a doctor?" And she says, "No, but I've watched a lot of medical dramas on TV." And then the last thing she says, or one of the last things she says, "Good news is her kidneys are beating." And so it's a very interesting commercial. But when they've done studies, they have found out that most patients get their information about CPR from watching TV shows. There was a study that just looked at 60 episodes of 3 shows, ER, Chicago Hope, and Rescue 911, that was published in the New England Medical Journal. And 72% of the people in the TV shows that received CPR survived. And most of those stories implied that they had long-term survival. And only one patient incurred any obvious disability after CPR. That tells you something about the power of TV. I was called down to Vanderbilt Hospital because one of my elders at the church where I was preaching, they thought he'd had a heart attack, and I got down there, and it was years ago, it was in the 80s, and so there were just the kind of draw curtains between each bed. And I heard that sound that you always hear on TV, that flat line. And, I perked up. But then I heard the man in the bed on the other side of that curtain say to the doctor, "Am I dead?" And the doctor, without missing a beat, said, "Sir, if that happens, you'll be the first person I tell." And, I'm sitting there with the man who's wondering, what his condition is. I wanted just to roll on the floor. I mean, with the response that just like that he gave to the person. But here's some interesting further information. There was a study done where they interviewed 520 emergency room patients and their mates in the waiting rooms, done by the University of California in June to September of 2016. And they found out that most of the information people had about CPR, 95% of those people said, "We got our information from TV." 1/2 of the people estimated that if a person had CPR, that 75% of them would succeed, would continue to live. And they thought that wasn't related to age or ethnicity or personal health care experience. And when they asked them whether or not they wanted CPR done, of those 520 people, 90% of them said they wanted CPR if it was needed in order for them to survive. but only 25% had ever discussed CPR with their physician. A study was done about long-term outcomes of CPR with people 65 plus years of age. When they had an episode in the hospital and they received CPR, 83% of the people in the hospital that had cardiac arrest died. 9% left the hospital because they'd been deprived of oxygen for a substantial period of time with moderate or severe neurodisability. And only 8% had mild or no neurodisability. But 83% had died. Now, there was a long-term outcome study done, and about discharge information that was published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2013. It had similar statistics. 83% died, but out of the 17% that survived, 9% were discharged to inpatient facilities, like what we call nursing homes or skilled nursing facilities. Only 7% were discharged to home, and 1% was discharged to hospice. And so we need to know about the negative effects and impact on health before consenting to an intervention. And when most people end up having these discussions is when an ER physician in a time of very severe crisis is trying to help a family and trying to educate them. And that tone of discussion is affected by a lot of those preconceptions people have, not based on a lot of data, but based on what they've experienced in their life or they've seen on TV, and so they overestimate the success of CPR and they underestimate the morbidity of CPR. And so those are just facts and figures in one sense, but in another sense, I think it helps to talk and say to someone, look, you can choose to have CPR, and that's fine. It's your decision. You have that right. But you can also choose not to. Because when someone has chronic illness upon chronic illness upon chronic illness, and they say, yeah, I'll do CPR, if you're there when that happens, and they're having the chest compressions, and you know that if they're at 60% quality of life, they're not going to come back to that. They're probably going to come back, if they come back at all, to 40% or less. And it's not going to give them the cure, the success, the cure that they maybe are hoping for. And it is a tough thing to go through initially, because often with those compressions, when you do it right and you're not doing it on a mannequin, you're going to hear ribs crack. You may perforate a lung. And then they've got to get over that as well. Kevin, please.
Gary, are you able to be here next week?
Yes, sir.
Why don't we take the first part of next week and you take your time going over the treatment?
Okay.
Because that's a good little bit of information.
Okay.
And then if we have some time left after that, maybe you and I can do question and answers over this.
Okay.
It's probably spurring a lot of questions that we can. So let's spend next week going over the treatments. Do you want them, yes or no, and then answering questions together.
That'd be great. That'd be fun. And the thing that I would tell you, like I would tell anybody else, these are your personal decisions. And I'll support whatever it is you want. And I'll ask your family to do that as well. But thank you for being here tonight. Our time is up. I think that's what the little bell meant. And so thank you for coming, and look forward to seeing you next time we have an opportunity to be together. Thank you.